In this movement, which we call life, the movement of life has within it the original mystery out of which it originally had its genesis. This particular point, when missed, yields a clumsy logic which is never able to be self-consistent. The inconsistency of this kind of language is based upon a faulty geometry, and that faulty geometry in intellectual history is called Cartesian space. The basis upon which all of the flaws on all of the levels is established is to not remember or to not know that presence includes its quality when it moves. That, put into the I Ching's terms, when Te is dynamically working, all the Tao that there is within it. So it's important to understand that while reality is the context for existence, as long as existence is dynamically occurring, reality is there with it. The context is not left behind as some kind of place remainder, like in a simplistic mathematics. It's not left behind as some transcendent or some unapproachable or as some invisible box, but that existence carries with it the real, which makes every focus of existence a potential source for a well to the Tao. Now, this is extremely simple, and yet it becomes extremely difficult. It becomes difficult if we have a mechanical way of understanding dynamics. And the mechanism of dynamics, its mechanicalness, is always based upon a kind of a structure that used to be called, when this kind of critique first was energizing in the English language, when it was first really being looked at in a powerful way, one of the children's toys that was popular in that era was Tinker Toys. Before things were Mickey Mouse, as in stupidly simple, they were Tinker Toy. With Tinker Toys, you had the little round matrices or nexes with the little holes around the circumference and the little dowels. In order to build anything, you had to take a little dowel and stick it into a little round hole on one of these little round wood circles. And you could only construct with Tinker Toys in this way. This is an error in construction, for Tinker Toys do not take any kind of stress once the structure is built. And so too, in ideas built upon this basis are very fragile, very brittle. And lives that are dependent on those kinds of fragile structures become full of jeopardy all the time, and rightly so. Another way of looking at this is in terms of architecture. Frank Lloyd Wright introduced a concept into architecture called continuity. That continuity is where the very structure is also the shape of the house. Instead of having a post and beam, Tinker Toy-like, one had a house structure which was rooted, and the root came out into a central supporting trunk, and all the other members were like branches cantilevered out from the center. He called this the organic structure of architecture, much like a tree. And it turns out that the tree, with its roots in the ground and its trunk and then its branches cantilevered out, that the tree as a structure is primordial. It not only shows an organic continuity of structure, such that any pressure anywhere on the tree distributes itself throughout the frame of the entirety of the structure, but also that the structure of the tree, having a double clump, the roots on the bottom, the branches on the top, with a single trunk in between. The structure of a tree is also a receiver of resonance. The tree is a natural receiver, and all one needs to add to the receiver is a tuner. So that the ancient image of the Buddha meditating under the Bodhi tree is actually an engineering template of how to make a tuning of the natural reception for a continuity structure in life. The same is true here of getting away from the tinker-toy idea of education, the tinker-toy structure of personality development. It's very important to understand that there is a continuity of movement here. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright's continuity was augmented later on by Buckminster Fuller, who developed the geodesic dome out of this principle. And Fuller invented a term called tensegrity. That is to say, it has integrity which is dynamically distributed through the tensile strength of the structure. Thus, one has tensile integrity or tensegrity. And this tensegrity means that the structure distributes stress, distributes burden, distributes weight throughout its entire system. The most perfected of all tensegrity forms in organic life is the egg. And while the egg shell itself, at any particular point, is very thin and should be brittle, the egg shell in its oblate form has a lot of tensegrity and can withstand surprising impact. The human cranium, in its shape, also has tensegrity. So that there are structures, and what we're trying to wean ourselves from is a faulty structure about development, about maturation, about education, about personality. And the root of the flaw is that somehow there is a leftover when existence occurs. Out of this comes a fatal flaw. The fatal flaw can be enunciated in this kind of way. It's a formulation. If life does not carry reality with it, then life is but an appearance, a mask, an illusion, which should be thrown away as quickly as possible so that one can return to the real. This does a disservice to life and to living beings, and happens to be structurally unsound as well as invalid logically. Now, put into our course at this particular time, we're just beginning, and we're beginning with the I Ching and with Thoreau. We're beginning with ancient Chinese Taoism before it became an ism. Ancient Chinese Tao, and with early American plainness, the kind of plainness that allowed Thoreau to write in Walden this kind of sentence: the very simplicity and nakedness of man's life in the primitive ages imply this advantage, at least, that they left him still but a sojourner in nature. A sojourner is someone who is a traveler, traveling through. But a sojourner also is a traveler who is cognizant of the happenings and recognizant of the context. Very often in Hellenistic Judaism, the image of the sojourner was taken to be someone who is in the world but not of it. And perhaps the most famous remembered quotation is from the epistles of Paul, and Paul got it from Apollos of Alexandria, who got it directly from the man. That the sojourner in nature is what man was in primordial conditions. Let's displace Thoreau's primitive here, because primitive has become a loaded, weighted word. To us it means immature, whereas early man was not immature at all, but primordial. And how do we know that primordial man had this maturity? By the fruits you shall know them. We wouldn't be here if they weren't mature. They would not have advanced us. They would not have brought us here. Another way is that one can see that the maturation is not only in the level of primate development, but exists on the level of the structure of life itself. There would be no possibility of the synthesizing of protein by the amino acids were the amino acids themselves not coded and cued by a DNA sequence that already carries the real with its existential dynamic. For if the double helix of the two strands of DNA were not able to be perfectly balanced in terms of the real, they would not be able to carry the memory function of the pairedness all the way through, which existence requires for form. A simple way to say it, existence would have no way to make sure that it registers in the right way at the right time. That focus of the right way at the right time, in the right place, that focus is guaranteed by the very structure of life itself. The very nature of organic structure has this. Now, for our education, for our maturation, we're trying to circumvent a whole jungle of resistances and errors and flaws, which are so deeply embedded that they are endemic in the situation that we find ourselves. Psychologically, our personalities are already skewed in so many ways that it is almost impossible to bring them into any kind of individuation. The social context within which a psychology functions is even more confused, even more skewed. And the historical currents are so backed up by our time that it's either a swamp-like stillness or they are the meaningless eddies of futile oars going nowhere. And there are contexts even larger than these, deeper than these. The right technique is that once enunciated by Carl Jung, when some woman at Ascana asked him, "Why does your therapy not go back like Freud's again and again into basic childhood sexuality?" And Jung, smoking on his pipe, said, "It's more effective to teach an adult a new way than to go back and try to remake your babyhood. In Freudian psychology, one talks about the birth trauma is the initial jar which sets the polarities of ego and id into collision. One cannot talk about a birth trauma. For in order to know what a birth trauma is, we would need to have a perspective outside of birth, and there is no one who has not been born. And so it is meaningless to talk about a birth trauma when we have nothing to compare it with. None of us have not been born. So in order to circumvent a whole jungle of resistances and problems, and our emotional nature, as we will see in myth, experience has a high degree of intelligence in feeling. Feeling refines itself in the ability to make form, to make defenses, to make alternatives long before the thinking maturation of the mind comes to any kind of parity with it. Feeling outdistances thinking very, very quickly. A child, not even 1 year old, already has enough feeling intelligence to begin to maneuver by a very limited repertoire of responses and navigate its way in the world long before the thinking function has even cued in. The problems that we have, the resistances which are there, the pain which is already in place, is shaped and held by feeling on levels deeper than tailored thought can go. And they are already registered in the body long before the mind achieves enough objectivity to balance it. The ancient way, the tried and true way, is to go through a purifying cycle, much like a stream. In nature, a stream running over rock will purify contaminated water in about 2 miles. And this kind of natural process also reveals itself on every level, down through to the base and on up through to where our education takes place. Our pace here, our weekly pace, is a pace that initially was found to be effective in the ancient Sumerian origins of civilization. The use of the 7-day cycle in ancient Sumeria, brought into play by Sargon of Akkad about 4,400 years ago, was an alternative to the 10-day cycle of the Egyptians and an alternative of a 5-day and an 8-day cycle in other areas of civilization. We are the inheritors. We still have the week cycle and the 4 weeks making a month. We still have that lunar basis. And this is part of our education. In order to focus what I've just been talking about, all of it together, I'd like to give you my translation of section 25 of the Tao Te Ching, and we'll start today's lecture with this. This is from my translation of the Tao Te Ching, and we'll have copies available to be purchased in about 2 or 3 weeks. Chapter 25 of the Tao Te Ching, and notice that chapters, like chapter numbers in the Tao Te Ching, the 81 chapters, are a tinker-toy structure imposed upon the Tao Te Ching. The original Tao Te Ching was just simply 5,555 characters without any punctuation whatsoever. The punctuation into sentences, into chapters, into pauses is all up to the reader. And it's only for convenience of reference that I accept that this is chapter 25. I've translated the Chinese beginning of this. There are two words which translate as, one is a character which means mysterious, and the other is the character which means image. And so I've translated it, imaging the mysterious. And already there's a kind of absurd paradox going here, for the mysterious cannot be imaged. Yet one needs in existence to have images, for images are like the ball bearings upon which the movement of feeling has its dynamic. Without this quality of images, feeling would not be able to have its fluidity. And so feeling for its intelligence needs images. And yet the mysterious forbids by not so much an impossibility of being imaged, but the mysterious is so permanently ambidextrous that any image that could correctly present it would obviate visibility by the complexity of its scintillation. I don't know how to say it any better than that. It would be so iridescently complete that it would not be visible from any particular angle as any particular structure. So when I say the mysterious cannot be imaged, it's not that someone hasn't tried or that one shouldn't keep trying. It's that it is like image repellent rather than that it's forbidden. And so chapter 25 of the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu also gives us this peculiar quality of imaging the mysterious, and it translates in this way. There being everything's completion before heaven, earth exists, calm, incorporeal, singularity within the changes, going wherever, not resisted, thereby becoming heaven, earth's mother. I don't know the name. The characterizing presence is called Tao. Forced to become named, call it great. Great called elusive. Elusive called distant. Distant calls in returning. And so, as best I can in English, I've delivered Lao Tzu's ancient Chinese, and this is the ecology of the Tao. Now, what I'm encouraging you to notice here is that nowhere in this does Lao Tzu talk about yin and yang. The yin and yang tinker-toy structure is a school of thought made about the time that Aristotle lived in Greece by Tzu Yen in China. And it was an academic school. It was a way of understanding based upon polarity. And that polarity was a disjunctive separation of is and isn't. That Parmenidean disjunctiveness. Now you can talk about existence in terms of polarity, and it is effective. But it's also misleading because one comes to believe that existence is polarized, whereas in fact, the belief that existence is polarized is a Cartesian geometry error. And as long as you understand space in a Cartesian way, there will always be the wondering question, unanswerable, who is the unmoved mover? There is no unmoved mover. It's a medieval tinker toy idea borrowed from a flawed perspective in antiquity and furthered in the 16th and 17th century by not very widely learned individuals and passed on to us today. Unfortunately, a great deal of science is still prejudiced by this whole strata of confusion and of flaw. It wasn't until the 20th century that these particular box canyons, these particular flaws that lead to box canyons, were demonstrated again and again. And at the beginning of the 20th century, and at the middle of the 20th century, and at the end of the 20th century, there have been demonstrable proofs of the inability of this flawed outlook to proceed any farther than simply sketches in the sand. At the beginning of the 20th century, if you want to brave trying to read it, in 3 volumes, fat volumes from Cambridge University Press, they're still in print for god-awful sums, Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead, Principia Mathematica, a rewriting of Sir Isaac Newton's Principia, which showed that the forms of mathematical structure are synonymous with the structures of logical expression. It means that language, when logical, follows mathematical forms, that they're inseparable because they are the same. At the middle of the 20th century, Ludwig Wittgenstein, in a book called Philosophical Investigations, showed that silence is the only result of following partial logics. Because any logical system which is refined enough and large enough to say something meaningful already has outstripped its capacity to define its own axiomatic bases, and that you need an auxiliary, a corollary logical system to define the axiomatic basis upon which that system works. Popularly known in the 1950s as the mystery of the bug list. Computer people dealing with logical programs in the 1950s found that the more complex the program, the longer the bug sheet. And that when you got a really sophisticated program, the bug sheet became so long as to make it inoperable. One of the great founders of logical application in machine languages, Marvin Minsky, once wrote, he said, it's very easy to put university mathematics onto a computer, but no one knows how to put first grade arithmetic onto a computer. It's simply too difficult because the more fundamental and primordial that one becomes, the less and less usable are these flawed structures, the tinker toy structures. Their brittleness shows. And so too, in this kind of educational ecology, as we proceed along with it, let the continuity of the flow take us where we can. Thoreau, in his Walden, tells us the following. In this course, which our ancestors took, there was a show of prudence at least, as if their principle were to satisfy the more pressing wants first. But are the more pressing wants satisfied now? When I think of acquiring for myself one of our luxurious dwellings, I am deterred, for, so to speak, the country is not yet adapted to human culture. And we are still forced to cut our spiritual bread far thinner than did our forefathers their wheaten. Not that all architectural ornament is to be neglected, even in the rudest periods, but let our houses first be lined with beauty, where they come in contact with our lives, where the houses come in contact with our lives. Let beauty first be an interface before you think about ornamental. Like the tenement of the shellfish. What is the tenement of the shellfish? The shell. Like the tenement of the shellfish, and not overlaid with it. But alas, I've been inside one or two of these houses, the houses that exist now in Thoreau's time. He's been in the houses and know what they are lined with. They are not lined with an interface of beauty between life and the expressive structure of where we live. They are lined with confusion. As Frank Lloyd Wright once said, the basis of fascism is to put man into a box and cut a hole for a window and another hole for a door and punch little holes for the functions of plumbing and electricity to come through. And in this perforated box, we must consider this the focus of our divine nature. A population that lives in such a degenerate venue is already mulched as a fodder for the next tyrant. As Wright continued to write on the same page, he said, I set out early in my life to destroy the box as a acceptable form for human life, and to open up not only the walls, but the very structure. In this education, we're starting with Thoreau and the I Ching, because the I Ching has a structure which dynamically flows in such a way that Thoreau expressively flowers wherever the understanding of it would be. Our first reading was about walking. We read A Winter's Walk and the little essay called Walking, and you yourselves took your first walk from wherever you live around your neighborhood and back home. And you're to save the written record of that walk, because a year and a half from now, we will use all of this material, save it in some kind of a box. The American poet Kenneth Pachin once wrote a book of poetry which he entitled A Box for Assembling All Future Journeys. Well, this is a box for assembling the future journey of your understanding of the history of your life. So save these. The first sheet that you will save is the walk that you took and wrote down. Now, the first initial point, the genesis point, the initiation into form, must be followed by a second focus, which is able to be aligned with the first. If you can align the second focus, I don't say point, but we could say point. As soon as you have 2 points, you have a line. The basic Alexandrian, geometrical, Pythagorean, mathematical mysticism in Euclid is that a point is a focus without dimension, and when that point moves, when that focus without dimension moves, it makes a line. So in a way, the tinker-toy error in high school geometries today is that a line is the connection between 2 points. The reality is that neither point has any kind of thusness separate from the focus which it is. That is to say, if I take a pencil and I put a point on a surface, on a sheet of paper, that point there expresses in itself the reality of point. Whatever I do with that particular point will be real as long as I deal with it comprehensively, recognizing that it is real. A sketch is not an illusion, but if I cease to focus with vision, on the sketch as an expression of the real, and there is a separation, then the sketch becomes merely a doodle, merely some appearance vis-a-vis some real form. This problem is endemic in the maturation of thought. This problem characterizes the very essence and nature of the development of the way in which thought was given its dynamic form about 2,400 years ago, 2,500 years ago. The problem is codified in the dialogues of Plato, where anything is but a copy, a replica of a divine form which exists in reality, which is somewhere else. This is exactly the error that Socrates attempted to unearth in all of his teaching. For he would inquire of anyone, saying, let us love wisdom together. Let us philosophize together. And as we philosophize together and go deeper into the issue and the nature of anything, we will together discover that there is a level at which there are no more pros and cons vis-a-vis the so-called thing, and that the so-called thing will disappear, will be absorbed by an undualistic thusness. That the dual pro and con, the very structure of argument and conflict, conflates to an undividable unity, and that there are a finite number of levels that lead down to this. That point of undividable unity, Socrates said, was truth, aletheia, that the truth of anything can be reached, and that once one has reached the truth of one thing, the way is open and cleared for you to use that same method, that same process, the process and method of mutual inquiry, that once that trail is blazed, you can apply it to anything and find that they all come to a unified aletheia, and that unified aletheia was the good, and that the good, that good, at the same time is a one. Now, this quality in early education about 2,400 years ago, this Socratic quality of encouraging not by telling, but encouraging by eliciting response, is the best way to proceed. Otherwise, the inquiry is out of balance and there's no parity. For the teacher who assumes that they know more than you do may know more about a subject or other examples, but certainly doesn't know more about you than you do. And this misapplication is like taking a crowbar to, an odd little image came to my mind, like taking a crowbar to a tiddlywink. It's super overkill and doesn't work. So that an education that has as its model this Cartesian tinker toy, expert teaching a subject to you, assumes that you are a box which a content can be deposited in, and it's going to stay there, and if it doesn't, there's something wrong with you. That entire methodology is suspect, not only on one level, not only on a couple of levels, but on every particular approachable avenue and dimension. At this particular stage in my teaching development, I could tear it apart enough times to make a phone book sized list. It's flawed in such a riddled way that it's incomprehensible that it could be accepted. So our process here is one of eliciting. In ancient times, before thought was developed, it was called sympathy. The sympathy. Once the sympathy is established, it must be maintained. And as long as there is a parity of sympathy, there's no issue of control, there's no issue of manipulation. Even on the basis of genetic structure, this equanimity of sympathy is the very fundamental method by which organic structure itself is engendered. The four bases, adenine and thymine, cytosine, and guanine, always occur in pairs. And these pairs always occur in such a way that they're able to interlock with the complementary motion. That is to say, a pair of adenine-thymine bases, and A and T always occur together. C and G always occur together. This C and G interface with G and C. C and G, G and C. They link together so that there forms then this kind of equality where the double helix, an adenine and a thymine base, will always pair together. And wherever the complement exists, it always elicits and engenders from its polar helical complement the response. You will never find adenine and adenine paired together. You will never find thymine and thymine paired together. This means that on the structure of organic life, the principle of tinker-toy understanding of identity is a flaw. It simply doesn't occur. A equals A doesn't occur. It doesn't happen. The whole structural basis of identity is a misnomer and comes into play in the West with Aristotle. Excuse me, even though he studied with Plato for 20 years, he didn't listen. And perhaps as a gracious coda, he never experienced Socrates personally. And as a little footnote to that coda, Socrates' teacher was a woman, Diotima. And Diotima made sure that Socrates was ready to hear before she said anything. And the whole nature of Socrates, when he referred to himself as a midwife of ideas, was that he understood the feminine receptivity must always be energized. Receptivity must be energized to the level at which creativity is going to function. Otherwise, there's no fertility. The teacher cannot be more creative than the receptivity that's available from the students. And so there's a tuning that needs to take place. There's a sympatheia that needs to occur. And as Socrates would say at least a half dozen times in the dialogues of Plato, because Plato never forgot it, Socrates said, we can never learn anything until we are companions first. And out of this came a beautiful phrase used as the title of a book. Ruth Montgomery once titled one of her books, Companions Along the Way. This is the correct procedure in education, in maturation. It's like a love experience, that it's done together, it's done paired, but it's done in such a way that if one of the pair maintains its presence, maintains the reality of itself in existence, it will elicit from the mysterious the complement in existence. Let's say it simpler. One half of a truth maintained with perfect presence will elicit the other half of the truth, even out of nothing. This is the way in which existence and the real occur together. They're always a pair. One way to understand this in terms of genetic structure, the base, the substrate upon which the pairs of adenine and thymine, guanine and cytosine, the substrate in which they occur, is itself a pair of an acid and a sugar. And that phosphoric acid and that deoxyribose sugar occur in an alternation, so that their pairedness is not so much a pairedness in equanimity, like a bar linking them with a horizon of perfect equanimity, but they are paired in an alternation. And this alternation of the acid and the sugar, the phosphoric acid and the deoxyribose sugar, this alternation is the sine wave of the way in which an energy carrier works. It's a template by which existence is able to move and still be real. Let's end there. Let's return. Let's return with imaging the mysterious. Let's hear it again. Tao Te Ching, supposedly chapter 25, imaging the mysterious. There being everything's completion before heaven, earth exists, calm. Incorporeal. Singularity within the changes, going wherever, not resisted, thereby becoming heaven, earth's mother. I don't know the name. The characterizing presence is called Tao. Forced to become named, call it great. Great called elusive, elusive called distant. Distance calls in returning. This is the whole process of communication. There is a response, and when the response comes back to us, the circuit is completed. But it's not a circuit of polarity. It's a circuit rather like an ecology of complementarity. The speaker and the listener must be tuned together, otherwise nothing is heard. And if nothing is heard, nothing really has been said. So that in ancient wisdom teaching, the tuning was never in terms of a pitch pipe sound. Never that, but always in terms of shared silence. The first wisdom education that went to a population of men and women. Recall that archaic wisdom traditions always for only the king. They were made for the king only. But the first democracy of wisdom education was Pythagoras. And the very first injunction in the Pythagorean education was to keep your mouth shut for 5 years. The injunction to silence for 5 years. That you are not to participate in the conversations, in the talking, for 5 years. You had to learn to hear before you could speak. So that the very first level of a Pythagorean community were the acousmatiki. Acousma means like being able to hear. Acoustics, acousma. The acousmatiki had to learn to hear, and after they learned to hear was then an interiorization. The interiorization of the receptivity became a form. And the second level of that population were called the mathematiki, those who could see in their minds form. They did not learn to see forms in their minds through speaking, but through hearing. The patient listener learns to imagine in terms of structure rather than in terms of images. An idea which is built from images is able to be controlled by those who manipulate the images. But an idea whose form comes from the patient hearing is not able to be manipulated. Those ideas spring out of the gestalts of the real. Minds which can tell the difference are minds of a population of people who will never be ground into tyranny. At the very beginning of our education, and I mean beginning is a quotation on the basis of the cover. It reads, "Above all things, I hope education of the common people will be attended to, convinced that on their good sense we may rely with the most security for the preservation of a due degree of liberty." Thomas Jefferson to James Madison, December 20th, 1787. In the midst of the constitutional conventions, Jefferson wrote Madison from Paris. Education must reside in the living rooms of the population of a people. Otherwise, the forms of tyranny are going to outstrip the capacity for individuals to resist. In his Ascent of Man, Jacob Bronowski, in the 12th or 13th section of his old PBS series, Bronowski, speaking with the camera in his own living room, said, if by the end of the 20th century the learning of the world does not find a place in the living rooms of men and women like ourselves, it will be kept under lock and key in the power rooms of the clever, and they will not allow access. And there won't be much that men and women will be able to do for a very long time. There are such things, God forbid, as man-made ice ages. We don't need to do that, but we have to get busy and learn to build a campfire because the climate's changing. In Thoreau's Walden, and I want to encourage you to read some of Walden, the first 10 pages would be fine to get into. The first section of Walden is called Economy. Later on in Economy, Thoreau comes to discuss how he took possession of Walden, and he took possession after he built the cabin himself. And he started in late March, which means he started around the equinox, and he finished and was able to move in on Independence Day, the 4th of July. And he makes a point about where Walden is located. Walden is not so much the pond and the cabin beside the pond, but Walden is just 1.5 miles outside of Concord and about 2 miles from the Concord battleground where the Revolutionary War began. The first shot, the shot heard round the world, was fired at the bridge over the river there. And on the far side of that river was Emerson's house, located exactly where the American Revolution first started. Thoreau located his cabin at a juncture from Thoreau's house and the Revolutionary War and the town of Concord, and where that focus met on the 4th of July and Independence Day, 1845. He went in to see what receptivity would form. He went in like an American yogi to sit patiently for 2 years and 2 months, to, as he once wrote, to stand with the trees in a snowstorm, because no one has done this for a very long time, in order to be together with them. And when you do this, one comes to a very startling symbol. And in Walden, one of the symbols that emerges out of this immersion into nature, one of the symbols that comes out of the real, is in a snowbound moment where the snowdrifts are higher than the doors, higher than the windows, so that the entire cabin seems to be submerged in the ocean of winter. The only place where one can see a patch of blue sky is to go to the fireplace and look up the chimney. Someone who has learned to do this where they live is free. Our education here is an encouragement, an invitation to weather even the winter of time forms and be able to find a place, a core, to look out and see the real. There is a blue sky above every cloud bank, at least on this planet. Some planets, it's a green sky. Others, like Mars, it's red. On Mercury, it's completely black, except for the night side with all the starry canopy, and on the day side, it's just a sun glare. On Jupiter, one gets the beautiful swirl of the iridescent cloud forms. In Walden, there is a section called Where I Lived and What I Lived For. It follows economy. And this is a little bit of what Thoreau wrote. The only house I had been the owner of before, if I except a boat, was a tent, which I used occasionally when making excursions in the summer. And this is still rolled up in my garret. But the boat, after passing from hand to hand, has gone down the stream of time. With this more substantial shelter about me, I had made some progress towards settling in the world. This frame, so slightly clad, was a sort of crystallization about me and reacted on the builder. It was suggestive somewhat as a picture in outlines. I did not need to go outdoors to take the air, for the atmosphere within had lost none of its freshness. It was not so much within doors as behind a door where I sat, even in the rainiest weather. The Harivansa says, "An abode without birds is like a meat without seasoning." Such was not my abode, for I found myself suddenly neighbor to the birds, not by having imprisoned one, but having caged myself near them. Notice this crystallization. Notice that how form, when it takes a structure, one can say of that natural way of occurring, we can even use the metaphor crystallization. And we saw last week that even in the earliest forms of inorganic nature, crystallization is a form which distills. Even before organic chemistry has begun, inorganic structure has found a way to purify through crystallization. And in a way, the modern preoccupation with crystals is an intuitive insight into the earliest form of distillation, inorganic distillation. This process of form is accelerated, it's condensed and speeded up when it comes to organic chemistry. Now, the forms of organic chemistry are woven together, and the threads that weave this together on one level, on one horizon of structure, the threads that weave this together are amino acids. There are about 20 amino acids. These amino acids, when they weave together, are proteins. And proteins are the structural building block for life forms. Those amino acids are assembled on the basis of a script. And this script is what is carried in the structure of DNA. But the way in which that script is able to be communicated, to be passed on from one cell to another, is through one half of the DNA, one helix, the RNA, the messenger RNA, which is very much like a microbiological snake. And its movement, its dynamic, because it has this helical quality, the RNA, when it moves with a snake-like movement, a rhythm, an alternating contraction and expansion rhythm. So that the very nature of the acid-sugar alternating base, the phosphoric acid, the deoxyribose sugar, the way in which they alternate as a substrate doesn't just mirror, doesn't just parallel, but is the way in which the dynamic movement takes place. When that messenger RNA comes to another cell, it elicits from that cell, from the genetic genome, from the chromosome level, it initiates a response to it which perfectly matches it in a complementary way, and a DNA double helix strand is created, is born. In a very interesting way, the ancient wisdom tradition used this double helix in the caduceus of Mercury, Hermes, the messenger of the gods. And the caduceus, the staff of Hermes, always had double serpents intertwined and meeting where the heads of the serpents met together. There was at the top of the rod a sphere. This particular image was characteristic of the Egyptian lineage of wisdom passed to the Greeks in Alexandria about 330 BC. It began to be passed. This image of the double serpents with the sphere at the apex appears in this photograph from a fabric which was found in the middle of the Gobi Desert in 1902 by Sir R.L. Stein. Here is the sphere in the center. Here are the double serpents. So you have the hermetic staff found in the middle of the Gobi Desert, put there about the 7th or 8th century, about 1,000, 1,200 years, somewhere around in there before Sir R.L. unearthed it. This was from the center of the Gobi Desert, Lulan, the cemetery there. If you turn that image around, if you take the hermetic side of it and turn it around, you have the Chinese version of it of two serpent-tailed figures. One of them is Fu Xi, the originator of the I Ching, and the other is Nu Qua, his celestial consort. He is holding the carpenter's square, which makes form. She is holding the plumb bob, which makes presence, which makes equilibrium. The equilibrium of receptivity complementarily paired with the squared possibility of form gives us what we call the possible range of forms of existence. In order for existence to occur at all, it must have form. And the form has a delimited matrix. This delimited matrix in no way contains it like a box. This matrix rather is like the parenthetical expressive possibilities that are available. So instead of thinking of form in the Cartesian dead-end way as a box which contains content, one has to remind oneself that form is a parenthetical expression which not only is mobile in and of itself, but has mobility within it, and also, by osmosis, mobility through it. So that one has an osmotic way of making a parenthesis. So that form now is not understood as a static box, but as a continuity of presentation. Later on, this can be identified as a very powerful idea towards the end of this year when we get into symbols. The idea is that symbols do not represent something else. Symbols present themselves. One of the most powerful statements of this idea was in Emerson, the early Emerson, in his little book, Nature, where he cautions his contemporaries to not overlook the fluid possibilities of the real, that it's not only that the real is transcendent, but that the transcendence is here now. That the transcendence has an immanence in existence. And we don't have to leave something behind in order to be elsewhere. We can take ourselves with us. So that transcendence is not leaving some shell behind, but to take with us our existence through the permeability of the parenthetical form. All forms, then, have changeability because they're all parenthetical. It's this changeability, coming back now to the I Ching, it's this changeability of form that makes possible the interface between existence and the real, between what could be called the transcendent and the immanent. In the I Ching, the movement can be expressed by the movement of a pair of lines, just like a pair of bases, just like A and T, adenine and thymine, guanine and cytosine. But the pair is not a polarized yin-yang. The pairedness is Tao-Te. Tao-Te. Lao Tzu's book is not called Yin-Yang Ching. It's called Tao-Te Ching. Because this movement in paired equanimity, Tao-Te, is the way in which mystery and unity osmotically interface with each other. And because they interface with each other, the two-ness in polarity is not a duality. The two-ness within polarity is an exchangeability between 0 and 1. So that when it comes to characterizing Jen, human-heartedness is the balance between Tao and Te. So that the reality in the presence of ourselves is Tao and Te, mystery and unity, balanced together. And as they balance together, what whatever structure is made on that basis will be a resonance, not of a line drawn between polarity points, but of a chord struck within a scale. And as one strikes a chord which is tuned, the scale of resonances will all be in a harmonic whole. And one will be able to recover the original chord through a progression of understanding back through the harmonic. Thus one has, in late 20th century advanced mathematics, whole excursions into harmonic analysis that read very much like Pythagorean mysticism of 2,500 years ago. One can read it almost on a metaphorical level, even though one is saying very basic mathematical, analytical phrases. It has this kind of peculiarity. One is reminded that one of the greatest comic demonstrations of all time was in the 1950s, where Mort Saul would take the evening newspaper and just read from it out loud and turn it into one of the most brilliant extempore comic strips imaginable. It's this kind of a quality that the everydayness of the language now, on certain levels of human conscious expressibility, are metaphorically very close to the mystery utterances of antiquity. You cannot tell the difference, and that is because the osmotic movement is so pure. This education seeks to restore to us the ability to appreciate the ancient as well as to participate in the new, both at the same time. So that the two-ness of Jen in the I Ching is not a two-ness of duality, but a two-ness of a kind of a sympathy that works together. And thus, when one looks at the bulk of the I Ching, the bulk of the I Ching is a series of commentaries that are distributed throughout the basic symbolic structure. It only takes one page to show you the trigrams, and in fact, you could have the trigrams and the hexagrams on the single page. Why is the I Ching 740 pages long? Because it has a series of 10 commentaries, and the commentaries in Chinese are called wings because they're always paired together. The first and second form a pair, the second and third, the first and second, third and fourth, fifth and sixth, seventh and eighth, ninth and 10th. So you have 5 pairs, 5 wings. And the 10 commentaries then come under this aegis, under this title. Those commentaries are not written by Fu Xi in 3000 BC, nor are they written by King Wen and the Duke of Zhou in 1100 BC, but they're written by Confucius about 500 BC. So that the I Ching, while being a Taoist classic, has the bulk of it a Confucian text. So that the whole idea, the whole notion of a polarity between Lao Tzu and Confucius is a bogus issue. It's like the polarity between Plato and Aristotle. It's a bogus issue. The differences are differences of expressive capacity to enlarge an ecology of understanding and a focus of intelligent thinking around seminal ideas, but in no way is a structural distinctiveness. That is to say, Confucius is the author of most of the I Ching in terms of quantity. Now, the commentaries, the wings, are made to work together. Where the trigrams are talked about, the most fundamental structure, the commentary on the trigrams, the Shou Gua, which in your I Ching would start on page 262. It's a very short section. You can read it for yourself. This Xiao Gua, this discussion of the trigrams, is the 8th of the 10 commentaries. It links itself together with the 7th commentary, which is called in Chinese the Wen Yin. Wen means the tradition of literature, the literary tradition. Deeper than that, the Chinese understanding of literature is that language on level of scintillation of mysterious capacity is able in its talking to have words come alive, and that when one talks in a very special way, one can have words come alive as things, and the most special language are words that come alive as the dragon. And so one of the great literary critical classics in the Chinese tradition is called the literary carving of dragons. That dragons are not creatures out there but are made when magical language is used in a specific, special way now, then the dragon is there. And the dragon is symbol of the Tao in this world. The dragon, as the Tao in this world, is only evoked by man speaking the right language exactly when. If man doesn't enunciate those magical words, then now dragons do not exist. They are not only improbable, but they are impossible. And so the Chinese way of focusing this appreciation is to use a proverb, an aphorism, very much like the logoi of Jesus or the aphorisms of Nietzsche, the condensing of wisdom into a saying. And the saying, we've had this before, the Chinese saying is, man is the bridge between heaven and earth. That is to say, heaven does not manifest as earth until man says it in the right way. Man's speaking of language in the right way brings heaven as earth. The Chinese have another phrase which works as a vertical that is a balance to this horizontal. Man is the bridge between heaven and earth as a horizontal, and the vertical that cuts across it exactly at the center is the saying, kingliness within, saintliness without. That is to say, the royal ability to hear is an interiorization of language. The pure way of expressing it is to give it to the world, not to keep it for oneself. For if the king were selfish, his kingdom would extend no farther than his own body. It's only the unselfishness of the royal that allows for the harmonic resonance of the presence of kingliness to permeate through the parenthetical form of the body, of the time, of the lifetime, of the place, and this resonance to go out into the community, and the community so integrated by that resonance is called the kingdom. This is the kingdom. Whenever a Chinese emperor began his reign, he would go to one of the 5 sacred mountains in China and perform the Feng and Shui ceremonies. They're remarkably like the classic ceremony that Moses performed around Mount Sinai. The king alone ascends to a certain sacred space near the top of the mountain and receives the divine capacity to hear correctly. And then comes down to the base of the mountain and gives out the resonance of what he has heard within as the edicts which will structure the laws of the kingdom for that reign. It's very much like receiving the Ten Commandments and bringing them down and letting the resonance of those Ten Commandments make the structure of the community by making its Torah, its laws, so that the Torah is a resonance fabric of a receptive purity. This is the nature of it. But that receptive purity as a structure does not enter in as content of things, but is the way in which invisibly the structure of things is modulated. So that a commentary is necessary for the people to be able to see that the alignment of things is according to harmonic principles that are invisible. This is the whole basis then of a commentary, the whole need then of a ritual level. This ability to use language to structure existence is a function of reality. So that when man uses language to make the structures of existence, he at once creates and recreates. Language as a transformational medium is the refining fire of the alchemy of this world. And we'll see in this education, as we penetrate, as we allow ourselves to reside more and more, not at some synthesizing idea, but in the lived presence of a parenthetical, osmotic capacity, more and more we will notice in our own selves, in the light of our own lives, an increasing resonance that begins to make sense out of everything, not in terms of some other referential pattern or grid, but in terms of our own livability. This is the purpose of an education, to invite us and to be there to help participate with us in this way. When Thoreau, in Walden, is coming to his conclusion, he writes in this way: "No face which we can give to a matter will stead us so well at last as the truth. This alone wears well. For the most part, we are not where we are, but in a false position. Through an infirmity in our natures, we suppose a case and put ourselves into it, and hence are in two cases at the same time, and it is doubly difficult to get out. In sane moments, we regard only the facts, the case that is. Say what you have to say, not what you ought. Any truth is better than make-believe. Tom Hyde, the tinker, standing on the gallows, was asked if he had anything to say. 'Tell the tailors,' said he, 'to remember to make a knot in their thread before they take the first stitch.' His companion's prayer is forgotten. However mean your life is, meet it and live it. Do not shun it and call it hard names. It is not so bad as you are. It looks poorest when you are richest. The fault finder will find faults even in paradise. Love your life poor as it is. You may perhaps have some pleasant, thrilling, glorious hours even in a poorhouse. The setting sun is reflected from the windows of the almshouse as brightly as from the rich man's abode. The snow melts before its doors early in the spring. I do not see, but a quiet mind may live as contentedly there and have as cheering thoughts as in a palace. Cultivate poverty like a garden herb like sage. Do not trouble yourself much to get new things, whether clothes or friends. Turn to the old. Return to them. Things do not change, we change. Sell your clothes, keep your thoughts. God will see that you do not want society. It's this kind of language in Thoreau that appealed to someone like Gandhi or someone like Tolstoy or to many in the 20th century. In a way, on this level, Thoreau is like an American St. Francis of Assisi. He has this ability to show that the osmosis is the most dynamic part of a form, and the osmotic communication between existence and the real is only stopped by our refusal to go with it. When we refuse to go with it, it's as if we become a stone instead of a mineral in the flow. But even the hardest stone can still be dissolved. One is reminded that late in Chinese literature, some 4,700 years after Fuxi, the greatest of all the Chinese novels, which is entitled The Story of the Stone, was a great Ming Dynasty novel about the mystery of reality. In the beginning of The Story of the Stone, which takes 5 thick books the size of the Brothers Karamazov to translate, in the very beginning of The Story of the Stone, there are 2 figures who are walking along in eternity. The Taoist of infinite space is having a conversation with the Buddhist of infinite time. And as they talk together, they come to a resting place. And at this resting place, they discover that there is a stone suspended in eternity. And they talk with this stone, and the stone tells them that when the universe was made, the making of the universe used every stone but one was left over, and this is this one. And because it was equally real with the universe but had no place in it, it was always like a loose card through the annals of life. And the stone had a very interesting career, for it showed up in various places at various times in human life. And it remembered all that happened to it. And to the Buddhist of infinite time and the Taoist of infinite space, there suddenly occurred to them mutually together to ask the stone, what was the best story that you ever heard in this universe? And the stone replied, it will take some time to tell it, and some place where we can rest. And the novel is the telling of that story. The story is a story of human life. We are such a precarious mystery, but the precariousness is not in us, nor in the mystery. The precariousness is in the brittle forgetting. Forgetting is like a thin, non-permeable, anti-osmotic film that coats us and keeps us where we are like a dead pill. We cannot break out of that pill, for the energy that would allow us to break out is already in the filmed coating. The way out is to dissolve, because the whole process of maintaining the film needs a constant supply of nourishment, otherwise it loses its energy. By not feeding it nourishing energy, the film of its own structure will dissolve. It's time dated. Its time dating is dependent upon physiological reality. The chemical basis upon which the film is made is engendered by the biology of organic cells. And the lifetime of a cell is not more than 7 years. If you could literally hold your temperament for 7 years in a continuity, your entire body would be freed from whatever shell, whatever film, whatever encumbrances are there. This, of course, implies super yogi. What is most interesting is that there is a principle enunciated by people like Feldenkrais in the discovery that minute movements perform as much exercise as vast exercise movements. In the concentration camps, Feldenkrais found that if you move minutely but all the time in a given pattern, you will have as much exercise as if you'd had a full workout. Or like the Bach flower remedies that use the most minutest quantities of something to cure, because the cure is not from the quantity, but from the response. All one needs is a pinprick of truth to elicit the full response. And so the film that corrals us is ignorance. And that ignorance cannot be broken through as long as we are within the form of ignorance. But ignorance can be punctured, and once it's punctured even at one point, it does not sustain itself. Why? Because ignorance is always a polarity preferential nightmare. As soon as you puncture it, it overcompensates way too much to try to fill that hole. And as you continue to puncture it, its overcompensation becomes more and more apparent. And all one needs to do is to continue this small effort. And the ability to make more and more overcompensating patches takes away the energy of the film which covers us. And the prison walls dissolve and of themselves. They become so involved in the patching process that they forget that they cannot sustain themselves also. In this way, one can conscientiously observe the unraveling of ignorance. And what is left is a tatter of old patches on something which no longer exists at all. And there's the uncanny pleasure of seeing the shingles of stupidity curling at one's feet. This actually happens. It can happen through a 2-year process like this. It takes a while to engender, but part of our heritage is to have this capacity. One way to help it is this next week to take a second walk. Walk from where you live, just as in your first walk, but this time keep one of the old 4 cardinal elements conscious: earth, air, fire, or water. Take your second walk with one of these elements in mind. Maintain in your attentiveness the noting of one of these 4 elements. If you choose fire, try to note the variations of fire: light, glinting, heat, wherever they occur during your walk, and write that down. This second walk will be different from the first walk, synthesized and coordinated by a definite conscious ritual element. This is the first step in a very sophisticated dance. This first step is very easy to do if you do it. If you don't do it, the justifications for not doing it are much more complex and haunting. It's simpler just to do it. We're going to save these 2 walks. because they're going to be the first step in a portfolio of material that we'll use when we do our histories a year and a half from now. And by this saving, by this record keeping, by this archiving of your own responses, a year and a half from now, you will be able to look at the chronology of your responses and discern a pattern in the material, a movement in the matrix. And it will have the uncanny distinctive tone of being familiar, for it will be the essential distilled quality of the way in which you move your existence in the real. A lot of the efficacy of this education is simply to hearten you and encourage you to do these simple steps. It's the dance of these simple steps that later on becomes the ceremony that liberates. More next week.